The 4th generation iPad was the last of its kind. It looked like the iPad 2 and 3, but made crucial improvements in performance, whilst having a retina display and lightning port. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today we're taking a look at the 4th generation iPad. How does it hold up 8 years later? If we're talking classic Apple, the iPad 4 was the end of the line, at least for iPads. It was released with iOS 6 back in late 2012, and the next year we got the iPad Air and iOS 7. There's no doubt the iPad Air significantly improved things, being faster, lighter, and having a 64-bit architecture. But that said, the iPad 4 does have a certain kind of charm that I would say is lacking in newer devices, at least to me, and it's held up really well, all things considered. While it's not exactly the smoothest experience on iOS 10, it is definitely a whole lot better than the iPad 2 and the iPad 3. But maybe I'm getting just a little bit ahead of myself here, so let's back up and talk about the design of the iPad 4th generation. The iPad 4 is housed in aluminum and is both a bit thick and heavy for today's standards, and yet I don't find it annoying to use. It's something that I could very well get adjusted to if need be, and I was to use it on the daily. It's one area where iPads have gotten better, particularly with the 2013 iPad Air and 2018 iPad Pro, but besides the form factor getting better, there haven't been a whole lot more changes. And in fact, when you compare the iPad 4 with the current cheapest iPad on Apple's website, technically called the iPad 7, they don't look a whole lot different. Yes, the bezels have gotten thinner, but the overall shape and look remains. Now, of course, the iPad Pro is a whole nother beast, but that too is similar in that it's a rectangle and runs iOS, I guess. Or, well, actually it doesn't run iOS, it runs iPadOS, but that's just iOS, so. The back of the iPad 4 is plain, simple, and curved, which makes it thinner at the edges and a bit more comfortable to hold as a result. We've got the silver aluminum accented by the black plastic buttons on the sides. On the top of the iPad we have the headphone jack, something that isn't on the current iPad Pro, but remains on the Air and the iPad 7. On the bottom of the iPad 4 we have the lightning port, something that was not only new to the iPad line, but to all of Apple's devices, as the iPhone 5 brought it around the same time. It's funny because people weren't super happy about the lightning port, but here we are 8 years later, still using it, and that doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon, as Apple seems to refuse to move over to USB-C, except for their iPad Pro, actually. Their iPad Pro does have USB-C, and that's pretty awesome, but the iPhone line, as far as rumors can tell, doesn't seem to be wanting to go the same direction. Turning to the front of the iPad, we have a 9.7-inch retina display with a resolution of 1536 by 2048 and pixel density of 264 pixels per inch. It's hard to believe this is an 8-year-old screen, ignoring the bezel size. It looks really good, and it's definitely one of the better qualities of this iPad. It technically wasn't new to the iPad line, as the 3rd generation iPad brought it in early 2012. Of course, the 3rd gen iPad was kind of a mess in that it was only sold for like 6 months or so, and just didn't have specs good enough to utilize that retina display, resulting in it being very slow on its current version of iOS 9. But that's another video for another time. We do have 2 colors that only affects the front of the device, specifically the bezels, white or black. I have white here, and there's lots of fingerprints, but it's also quite nice. Of course, the back is the same on both black and white. We have a non-Touch ID home button at the bottom of the device, and we can't really fault the iPad for that, as it hadn't been introduced yet. Even the iPad Air the next year wouldn't bring it, so if you want to keep your iPad secure, you'd need to put in a passcode the old-fashioned way. One major benefit of a bigger device is a bigger battery, and the iPad 4 has an absolutely massive one, with a size of about 11,560 milliamp hours. Despite being 8 years old, it can last multiple days without trouble, at least in my experience, and possibly even more, as again, the battery is absolutely huge. For perspective, the 2020 iPad Pro 12.9-inch model has a battery size of 9,720 milliamp hours. Sure, there's a ton of improvements that come with that, but ultimately the thicker body of the iPad 4 just allows for a better battery, and it's really nice to have here. Of course, keep in mind this thing is 8 years old, so if it's been used over the years, battery life is going to vary and might not be that good in some cases. Camera-wise, we have a pretty terrible 5-megapixel rear sensor that can shoot video in 1080p somehow. Pictures from this iPad look about as good as you'd expect, but I'll say that it's a pretty average camera for a non-iPhone back in 2012. Non-iPhone Apple built device. Apple just never really put their best camera hardware in their iPads, as the iPhone 4S the year before did have 8 megapixels, so technically they could have. Would a better camera be nice? Yes, but at the same time, it's a tablet, and honestly, no one should be taking pictures with their tablets, especially because everyone always has a phone in their pockets nowadays anyways. Of course, this wasn't always the case in 2012, but 5 megapixels in 2012 was definitely not out of the norm. These pictures are pretty self-explanatory. They're grainy and blurry and frankly, just of the era. But in good lighting conditions outside, you can get some decent looking shots. We have a 1.2 megapixel selfie camera, and while this was a pretty good upgrade over the 0.3 megapixels in the iPad 3, this isn't a good selfie. And not just because of my face, although that doesn't help. Alright, so while the camera is about as bad as you would expect, it was pretty darn decent for a 2012 tablet. I mean, think about different Android tablets from that era. There was so much junk on the market, just so many crap, cheap tablets that were just being tossed out there, and they all had just horrible cameras. It's safe to say this thing blew most of them away. Where the iPad 4 really shone was in the technical specs, as it brought Apple's A6X chipset and a single gigabyte of RAM. This was good enough to give the iPad updates all the way to late 2017 with iOS 10, and performance on each and every version honestly was pretty darn decent, and that goes for the latest. While app support is beginning to really lack on iOS 10, you still have access to relatively recent versions of most apps, and while I wouldn't call the experience smooth, it is usable. Sometimes slow, sometimes very slow, to be sure, but it isn't as bad as one might expect, and it's much better than the iPad 2 and 3 on iOS 9. While there's not really much point in buying one of these things anymore, if you already have one, there's definitely some use you can get out of it. It has iMessage. As a media player for things like Netflix or YouTube, it does the job. Although it's worth mentioning Disney Plus won't work on it, so if you're looking for a device for your kid, it's probably not the one to get. If you have one of these lying around and you want to do just anything with it, jailbreaking is always an option. You can really fine-tune the experience to your liking, possibly speed it up, and just have a fun time. Jailbreaking can be really fun. So is the iPad 4 still an okay machine for the basics? Yeah, it is actually. It might be 8 years old, but it's actually somewhat usable 8 years later, which is extremely impressive, especially considering the majority of PCs from 2012 probably aren't. I think I'm just about done here, but the iPad 4 in my eyes is one of the best built iPads Apple's ever made, especially compared to the very similar looking third generation. It lasted a long time, and even today is surprisingly usable, so props to Apple for that. My grandmother was using this iPad all the way until last year, when she upgraded finally to the iPad Air 3. And while it was slow, it got the job done. She was able to use her email, iMessage, things like Instagram, although Instagram for tablets is not really a thing. You can, but it's just a blown up iPhone version. It's annoying. But anyways, you get the idea. It worked. And so if you have an iPad 4, you might be able to find a use for it. If you don't buy it. I would say it's worth investing a little bit more money and getting an iPad that runs the latest version, but I always encourage using your old tech if you have it, because if it's just sitting around, you might as well try to find a use for it. Any of you still out there using this iPad? Did any of you used to have it? Let me know in the comments below. I don't reply to comments as often as I probably should, but I do actually read a lot of them. I won't say all of them because that would be a lie. So as always, I'm very curious to hear what you guys have to say on this very classic Apple product. If you found this video interesting, maybe hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. You can follow me over on Twitter and Instagram at 91_tech if you'd like to for some reason. And we also have a Discord channel you can check out, links in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Go Canucks go. It's hockey playoff season and I'm very into it. And that being said, I'm Josh from 91 Tech and I will see you all next time.